So I am finally ready to do an actual versus between my 2019 Nukeproof Scout 275 versus my 2021 Ragley Big Al. Both of them are frame up builds, so the specs will be different than what you will be buying from the website. I do have both these bikes at the same time, so I do try to ride them fairly back to back, so I will have a much clearer or finer detail between the difference of the two frames and the bikes themselves. Here is a photograph of my Scout in its various iterations, whether from the big long travel enduro downhill build to my lightweight single speed fun bike build. The Big Al was always built as a mullet with the longer travel 160mm fork. I will do my best to try to show one clip of the Scout and then one clip of the Big Al right after it, riding the same terrain, same exact trail, just so I can explain the differences of what each bike is doing between each scene. But because of how I'm doing the voice recording, it might not always make sense or match the video. So let's start off with the geo charts between the two bikes. For both bikes, geometry is actually fairly similar. They weigh fairly similar. So I'm going to do a range of what the geometry is based on how I build it compared to stock. So I'm going to list the number on the Nukeproof Scout first and then the Big Al. So the reach on the Scout is 425 and the reach on the Big Al is 440. The head tube angle on the Scout in the big enduro build is 63.5 and it's 65 stock with the 140 fork. The Big Al is 65 stock and currently it's 63 with the over forking and the mullet build. Seat angle is 73 on the Scout at the stock configuration. It's probably at around 71 on the enduro build. It still climbs surprisingly well, shockingly. The Big Al seat angle is 74 stock, so it's at 72 right now with my mullet setup. Wheelbase on the Scout is 1164 stock. With the long build, it was around 1195. The Big Al is 1197 stock, and it's currently at 1207. Weight on the Scout currently as a single speed, even with a tire insert, is 28.5 pounds. But when it was at the full enduro build with the long travel fork, it was at 32 pounds. The Ragley weighs exactly 32 pounds as well in the enduro configuration. Now this is something that opened my eyes, this particular geo number that I never considered, which is the stack height. The stock stack height on the Nukeproof Scout is 608, while the Ragley is 634. And now this is a number I will always look at in my future bike purchases because there is a big difference in how the bike feels, and I will explain that later on. So here you're going to see the me riding Lower Greenhorn at Mountain Creek. There's a bunch of other trails that's kind of like this at Mountain Creek as well. So on the Scout, I couldn't quite get the confidence to fly over the crests on the waves or like the rollers, because as you land at the bottom, it really feels like you're landing to flat. And I tried it a few times and it really wasn't good. It didn't feel good, one, and two, it kind of upset the balance of the bike when it lands. So instinctually, I would brush the brake to keep the tires on the ground so it will come in full contact, and that slows me down. However, on the Big Al, it's like riding a full suspension bike, I would say, on the same sections where I'll just go full brakeless. In fact, I will even be encouraged to do a little bit of pop over the crest to get the bike airborne to land. And then you can hear that the bike is a lot smoother as it goes through the section. It goes like zoop. Whereas on the Scout, you actually hear like the case, but a few times I do it's like oh. And the landing, you can hear that it is clearly harsher. So in conditions like this, the Ragley is definitely much more confidence inspiring, and I wouldn't even notice it right away until I had to take it to the bike park to really expose this difference. So here is a clip of me flying down 50 steps on both the Scout and the Big Al. And at first I thought maybe the Scout would have a much stiffer ride, but after I set it up back to the trail setting versus the dirt jump setting, the difference is very minimum. I can fly down both at pretty much the same speed and at the same stability. Here's me doing the Black Diamond jump line at Mountain Creek called Lower Dominion and Son of Salvation. The Ragley hurts less when you case a jump, and on big jumps like this you need all the help you can get on a hardtail.
Whoa. I didn't know there was a kicker over there. Here's the drop.
You're gonna see me do a lot of drops in this video because that's one of my favorite things to do on the hardtails. So the Scout can drop fine, and most bikes, the 27.5 bikes in general, do have a stack height of between 6'10"-ish, and you need to be on point with your timing to unload the front wheel, or else it's just gonna go nose heavy. But because the Scout was so slack and had such a big travel fork, it always covered me. But sometimes my drops were a little close for comfort if I wasn't on my A game. Whereas the Ragley has a stack height in the 630s, and it's probably even higher now since I over-forked this thing.
Jump, drop things. On the Scout, it was nose heavy, and I had to treat it like a drop. Let's see how does the Ragley take it. More neutral. Yeah, way more neutral in there.
And I'm telling you, like on that section that I talked about Cunningham, where they just had these little harmless, like 1 foot drops, like the Scout tendency is to nose down immediately, and I have to really unweight the front. Whereas on the Ragley, it's just so natural, it goes off it. Bike's neutral, I don't have to like fully unlift the front wheel. So that translates over to the bigger drops. So as you go into like 5 foot drops, 6 foot drops, you just pretty much stay neutral with slight unweighting at the front, whereas the Scout, it's like, you know, you gotta really get the timing perfect to do it right without killing yourself. When I rebuilt my Scout, because I did initially cannibalize it to build the Big Al, I missed it because I kind of have this nostalgia glasses on, or I thought differently because it did have the same thing. So when I built the Scout up again with the spare parts that I had, it was a very similar deal because I put a 29er 140 pike on there to get the stack height back to what it was when I had the 27.5 wheel and the 160 fork. And by the way, most 29ers and mullet bikes actually have stack height in the 630s. So, you know, this is kind of converting me over to running 29ers now almost. But anyways, in terms of being the ease of bunny hopping and manualing, I couldn't believe it because that was something like of a back-to-back in front of my house. I was easily able to roll the bars to my hips on the Ragley, like right away. 2 tries, I was able to get a big bunny hop. Whereas on the Scout, I had to like really do like maybe 10 hops to be able to get the motion down and the effort required to bring the bars to my hips to get a high bunny hop. So I hopped back and forth and I was like, no, there's definitely no difference in technique. It's purely just from the leverage that I get from having a taller stack height because their chainstays are identical at 435 in the rear. So I'm going to list out the pros for the Nukeproof Scout now. The Nukeproof Scout is a better sprinter, hands down. It's so fast, this bike. I built it as a single speed to give myself a handicap on my local trails where I'm riding with my newer riding buddy friends. And I'm setting personal records on Strava with this thing. So this bike's fast. It just rolls and keeps wanting to roll and keeps wanting to run. And the frame is still very compliant. You know, it's more compliant than the Vetus Nucleus. It's good for a hardtail. And the cornering is also better with the slightly shorter wheelbase. There is a particular section which I don't have a video of, but there's a trail in Meadowlark, and there's an area called Concrete Jungle where it's literally just crushed concrete boulders with square edges, and it's very tight, and it's downhill, traction sucks, so I can do it pretty easily on the Scout running the more difficult line, and I have no problems doing tight switchback corners on a long wheelbase super slack Ragley, but that's only on a relatively smooth transition or like smooth switchback. When you are forced to handle the bike on a really rocky terrain in the tight switchback areas, the Ragley felt extremely awkward, while the Scout I was just able to throw it around. So tighter areas, bad terrain, Scout's better in the cornering. Again, it's faster in the local trails, and it's easier to jump and get the bike off the air, up in the air when you're jumping, and also it's faster at the pump track just because of the fact that the frame is stiffer near the bottom bracket area, and you can transfer a lot more energy. The bike's a little shorter, so you have more of a leverage in terms of pushing the bike forward. Now the pros on the Big Al, it's more compliant, and you can really feel it being hooked to flat. It's a quieter frame due to the compliance, where less microscopic vibrations are traveling through the frame. So here's another confirmation that the Ragley is a more compliant frame in general, especially at high speeds and things start to get pretty intense. My brake pads on my Scout, or both bikes, they are Shimano SLX4 pistons with the Ice Tech thin pads. If you research it, they are notorious for being very loud, and they rattle within the caliper when you go on super fast chattery stuff. You don't notice this on regular trails, but when you're bombing down like a rocky trail with a lot of little pebbles and marbles at like 20 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour, the thing, you can hear it, it just rattles. And I was like, what the hell is this sound? But then I'm doing the same trail on the same brakes on the Ragley, and the pad rattling is gone. Same torque and everything. I was like, well, what do you know? You know, I was gonna do the extra stuff to shim the pads so that they wouldn't bounce around as much, but I don't need to with this frame. Now, I know all of this is making it seems like I'm making the Scout ride like an anvil, but it absolutely doesn't. As you can see here in Blue Foria, I'm still going down the chattery stuff, and yes, while you do hear the brake pads rattle, most of the people that complains about the rattle have full suspension bikes, so it's not even like it's a hardtail thing only. And compared to other hardtails I've ridden, the Scout is still a very good riding hardtail, and most people who've ridden it agrees with me. But when you have one compliance or more compliance towards one way, it does negatively affect the other thing. So the Ragley doesn't sprint as good as the Scout, and it's not as zippy and poppy. So that's the sort of difference between them is small, but the small difference in the sprinting ability is the difference between the compliance between the two frames. And you'll truly only feel the difference if you're casing a big jump on the Scout or doing a huck to flat. Otherwise, you really won't notice the difference between how both frame rides.
Ragley and the Scout, it's that drop. God, that hurt.
Well, I wouldn't exactly say big, but it's noticeable after you ride them back to back. But in general trail riding, it took me months to really finally feel the differences between the two frames. It's nuanced, but it's there after you take it on all variety of terrain. And I was actually glad that I gave it this long to do a comparison, because now I have a much better understanding of the difference between these two bikes. I would also like to add that the Scout was the most compliant hardtail I have ever ridden until I have ridden the Ragley. So my initial impressions of the frame wasn't impressive, but man, I don't know what they do to the frame to make it ride so good. But again, it sacrifices the snappiness, the acceleration, the playfulness to get that ride, but it's still no slouch in the poppiness department. It's just, again, not in the level of the Scout. I would say the Big Al rides exactly like the Norco Torrent HT steel hardtail, minus the dead feeling and minus the 2-pound weight. So that's pretty high praises for the compliance of the Big Al frame. Rides like a good riding steel hardtail.
That's if I don't.
And I actually forgot about the climbing. It took me like 20 minutes to realize I forgot to mention about the climbing between these two bikes. If you looked at the style that I ride and how I ride in most of these footage, I don't really care about climbing, but climbing it is the necessary evil to get to the top to enjoy the downs. Both of these bikes are good technical climbers. They are hardtails after all. You push the crank, the bike moves forward. No fuss, no muss. Now in terms of their geometry, the Scout being a little shorter with a slightly slacker seat angle tends to have a tendency to want to wheelie a little more, whereas the Ragley is more planted. The Scout has a slightly higher bottom bracket at 304 millimeters. The Big Al, because I'm mulleted, it's actually low at like 298. So sometimes the chain ring on my bash guard bashes a little more.
Okay.
But if you look at my video from Sprain Ridge, where I'm basically riding up spines and stuff like that, punching up rocks, Scout does the same thing, maybe even a little easier than the Big Al. So in terms of less chance of wheeling,
This way.
Big Al's better, but in terms of technical punching the bike up, the climbs, Scout is better. But either one is better than any full suspension bike that I've ridden. And the most efficient full suspension bikes that I've ridden is a Santa Cruz 5010 V4 or the Norco Fluid FS1. And they're nice, but you can still feel the difference in efficiency between the full suspension and the hardtails. So what's the overall takeaway with these two bikes? You can't go wrong with either bike. But if I had to keep one, due to the fact that I want a one bike do it all bike, I will have to sadly pick the Ragley now. But the Scout is still a pretty sick bike, and it is a better local trail bike. I do have more fun when I'm blasting my local trails with it, hitting the jump line with it, but the Ragley just feels like it will cover your butt more when you're riding more intense terrains, bigger drops, and it's still snappy for a bike that rides this good. So unless you ride them back to back, you really can't feel it enough, and it took me this many months to feel the difference between them. It's snappy, just not on the level of the Scout, and the Scout is a better trail bike that's hardcore enough to still do bike park laps at the tech trails or the flow trails. So sorry about the editing. I am not going to sit through all the details to edit every individual clip. So I basically pulled from my library of pre-edited clips. That's why some scenes you see with like the name of the trails and the bike park in there. That's not my main goal here, to make a pretty video. My main goal is just to inform, so I apologize. But if you enjoyed this video, if any questions, just leave a comment in my comment section. Thanks for watching. Bye.